Week 7, Lesson 3. Nick Fury. As Stan Lee started to get more popularity creating characters like the Hulk, Iron Man, Ant-Man, Spider-Man, and the world's most popular interpretation of Thor, he became known as the Man in writing comics, and started to develop a reputation that he could make any idea work. One day, he had a friendly bet with his publisher, Martin Goodman, that he would be able to make a World War II comic work, even though the war had been over for almost 20 years. As a result, in 1963, we got Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos. While it wasn't a huge hit or changed anything like Spider-Man or the Fantastic Four did, it showed people were still interested in non-superhero comics. The comic came out 5 years after DC Comics character Sergeant Rock first appeared. Sergeant Rock was written and drawn by Joe Kubert, and while the comic was safe for kids to read, it showed a more realistic version of the war. He used real weapons, he worked with believable teammates, and his group would go from one hopeless mission to the next. While it quickly became established that Sergeant Rock and his men in Easy Company were going to be killed off in any giant gunfight, their actions were never too over the top. Nick Fury was the opposite of this. Nick Fury headed a diverse team of commandos with different degrees of training from one crazy situation into another. In the first issue, the 7 commandos go up against an entire German army and hold their own against it, causing plenty of German death and not losing a single commando of their own. In issue number 6, they take on the German General Rommel's entire desert fleet, and fail to beat him. But get away with their lives, only to have the French resistance tell them that they needed to let Rommel be alive because he was involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler. In issue number 9, they kidnap Hitler. But in issue number 4, the series did something that just wasn't done. It killed off a member of its team. And not just any member, but the youngest one. Private Jonathan Jr. Juniper was shot and died in battle. This was unheard of for a comic at the time. To kill a character and have them stay dead set this comic apart from other war comics like Sergeant Rock. The book also did another big move by killing Nick Fury's girlfriend, Pamela Hawley. She was first introduced in issue number 4 and was killed in issue number 18. She was killed off-page in a bombing raid in London just before Sergeant Fury was about to propose to her. This is the first time in comics when a main hero's primary love interest had died. The character of Nick Fury became less fun-loving and more serious after this incident, showing a lasting change for the character. Since Howling Commandos took place in the Marvel Universe and not our own, they would occasionally come face-to-face with mad Nazi scientists with laser beams, and characters like Captain America and the future Mr. Fantastic, Reed Richards. It was a fantasy, over-the-top adventure with many comedic moments, but it had a higher casualty rate than its rival war comic, Sergeant Rock. Stan Lee claimed that it was Nick Fury and not the Thing that was Jack Kirby's self-insert into the Marvel Universe. When Kirby was asked about this, he later explained that Nick Fury was how he wished people would see him. The Thing is how he felt people saw him. Nick Fury was a popular enough character, so Stan Lee and Jack Kirby wanted to bring him out of World War II and into their current Marvel timeline. So, he made his first contemporary appearance in Fantastic Four issue number 21, one of Marvel's biggest selling books at the time. His first appearance seemed popular enough that Stan Lee wanted to put the character in a more relevant role in the world of the 1960s. And, as we all know, the Cold War was starting to heat up around that time, and thanks to James Bond movies, fictional spies were beginning to become a big hit with the average person. A popular TV show at the time was a spy thriller called The Man from U.N.C.L.E. Stan Lee took this title and gave Nick Fury his own spin-off, where he was Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. Nick Fury was put in charge of a top-secret organization that would protect the world from dangerous threats, like ex-Nazi commanders and Asian warlords, and he had to do all this while missing one eye. The stories were written in a book called Strange Tales, which Nick Fury shared with another Marvel character, Doctor Strange. They only took up half an issue, but told serialized stories about Nick Fury's adventures leading a spy organization. He hired many of the Howling Commandos and fought newer, more current threats, using high-tech spy gadgets to help save the day. The early spy stories were pretty forgettable, and I probably wouldn't have even brought them up if it wasn't for a young artist named Jim Stranko. Jim Stranko was born in 1938 and worked as an illusionist in his youth. In 1957, he entered the industry as an inker, filling in other people's pencil lines. In 1966, he walked into Marvel off the streets with his portfolio. Stan Lee didn't want to be disturbed that day, but a writer looked at his work and immediately got Stan Lee to come down and see him. As fate would have it, Stan Lee was not impressed by one of his artists, John Buscema's work on the Nick Fury book. Buscema was erasing Jack Kirby's outlines and filling them in with his own. So, Stan Lee put Jim Stranko on that book. As Nick Fury's tales continued, Stranko started taking over more and more of the book. He started on inks, moved to inks and pencils, started writing the book, and even did his own coloring. He was pretty much taking over the entire creative process for the character. With each issue, the book became more and more experimental in its layouts. There were a lot of Kirby splashes with straight lines, but there were also a lot of Stranko's own touches, like having smaller, more vertical panels, or having the panels connected through a maze, or having clashing colors explode on the page. The pages can be a lot to take in, and force your mind to do a lot of focusing. Jim Stranko also took some of the uniqueness away from the comics, and in some ways made it more like other superhero comics. Until Stranko started writing the book, Nick Fury and his agents didn't have uniforms or costumes. Now they did. The uniforms were what the younger readers expected, and adding them was a way to attempt to boost sales. Possibly, not coincidentally, the changes to Nick Fury made him look like a World War II character that had since gone into public domain. Captain Battle. Captain Battle wore an eye patch to fight bad guys like the Claw, and used his portable jetpack for mobility. Once Nick Fury joined S.H.I.E.L.D., not only did he have the eye patch, but he also occasionally used a jetpack. Captain Battle would go around fighting smaller battles to stop the conflicts from growing. Nick Fury was doing the same thing. While it was never Stan Lee's intention to make the characters so similar, once Stranko started writing, the similarities started to add up. While the dialogue ranges from corny to cringe-inducing, the book is absolutely safe for children to read, but the target audience for the series was clearly older. This was a James Bond character, before Bond became child-friendly too. He set himself apart by working with a group of spies, and by being the head of the organization. But the comic also faced the same censorship that the rest of the industry had. In one page, it's clear that Nick Fury is having sex with one of the women that he knows. The censors thought this page was too racy and replaced the final panel with the gun slipping into the holster, which ironically was even more suggestive than what Jim Stranko claimed he originally drew. The majority of Jim Stranko's comic book work is tied with his work at Nick Fury during his time at S.H.I.E.L.D. He drew a few standalone issues, as well as 3 issues of Captain America and 2 issues of the X-Men. Pretty much anything he drew for Marvel stands as some of the best comic book artwork made during the Silver Age of comics. Jim Stranko was the first fly-by-night success in comics. He came in, completely revitalized everything he touched, created some of the best art seen in comics, and then just left. After he stopped making comics for Marvel, he became a painter. And he also did the storyboards for the Steven Spielberg movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. He also did the comic book adaptation for a science fiction Sean Connery movie called Outland. This was one of the few comic book adaptations which would be considered better than the source material. So why is Jim Stranko important to us? Because he evolved Kirby's art style into the next phase of its evolution. The characters didn't look blocky, and they embraced a more psychedelic layout and coloring. It's a clear example from the Silver Age where art takes precedent over storyline. It helped prove that comics could be just as experimental and create just as good pop art as anything modern painters could do. It showed that you could reuse the same characters for different genres, and people would be accepting. It helped prove that adults could get just as much out of comics as children did. It also showed that drawing comics could be a stepping point to help your artistic career, not be detrimental to it. The character Nick Fury himself is important as well, because he was one of the first heroes that had established characters die around him, which is a technique that would be used in the following decades to get readers' attentions. Questions to contemplate. You could argue that Nick Fury was originally a knockoff of Sergeant Rock, and later became a knockoff of Captain Battle. Do you think that potentially him being a knockoff undermines the importance of his character? Almost 50 years later, Jim Steranko's work on Nick Fury is still considered to be some of the best art that comics has ever produced. Why do you think comics haven't gotten more experimental art before him? Why has the artistic experimentation in popular comics been so limited since him?